Think you know who poses the biggest threat to Russia? Think again. While the US is often seen as the primary challenger to Vladimir Putin's power, there's another country that should have him quaking in his boots, and it's not who you might expect. Sure, we often focus on the geopolitical giants like the US, Russia, and China, but zoom in on Russia and you'll find a surprising contender emerging from the shadows. It's not America, but America's northern neighbor, Canada, that presents a formidable challenge to Moscow. Yep, you heard that right. Canada has far more influence on Russia's future than many, including Putin, may realize. In this video, we'll dive into the reasons why Canada is such a major thorn in Moscow's side and why it represents a significant threat. And it all comes down to one battleground: the Arctic Ocean. In April 2021, Russia filed a submission to the United Nations, or UN, with a single goal in mind: claim more of the Arctic Ocean and its seabed. Within the claim lay plans to extend Russia's territorial claims over Arctic waters right to the borders of Canada's exclusive economic zones, or EEZs. Under maritime law, an EEZ is an area of an ocean over which a nation can stake a territorial claim up to 200 nautical miles offshore from one of its coasts. Within that EEZ, the nation can both exploit the natural resources it finds to its own benefit by virtue of having a territorial claim over them and control the shipping that passes through the territory. Speaking to CBC, University of Durham professor Philip Steinberg says that Russia's submission to the UN would see it expand its own territorial waters by over 270,000 square miles, while granting it control of waters that are essentially right on Canada's back door. Naturally, Canada opposed the submission, not least because it had made a submission of its own that overlapped with a territory that Russia was attempting to claim. University of Calgary political science professor Robert Hubert noted that Russia's claim overlapped with Canada's in the North Pole region, but went far beyond that. Here's a situation where they're, meaning Russia, claiming the entire Canadian and Danish continental shelf as part of their continental shelf. Other commentators at the time took a more relaxed approach. Those included Whitney Lackenbauer, a professor at Trent University, who pointed out that Russia had gone through the appropriate legal challenges to make its claim. She also believes that Russia didn't seriously believe that it would gain much territory for which it made its submission. Instead, it was looking to bring Canada, Denmark, and other countries that lay claim to the Arctic's continental shelf to the table. Setting out to negotiate where the outermost limits would be was something that was always on the cards, she said. In other words, Russia was merely trying to accelerate a discussion that should already have been happening. Nevertheless, the claim was seen as a challenge to Canada's sovereign rights in the Arctic. Toward the end of 2023, the issue still hadn't been resolved, with Russia again emphasizing that it needed to exert its influence within the Arctic. The country's Navy chief, Admiral Nikolai Yevmenov, made this clear when he said, "There is a need for full-scale expansion into the continental shelf beyond the borders of the 200-mile exclusive economic zone." In other words, Russia needs to have more control over the Arctic. That would extend to 70% of the ocean, according to Maritime Executive, though negotiations would stall given that Russia was deep into its special military operation in Ukraine by the time Yevmenov made his statement. The questions are now simple. Why does any of this matter, and what does it have to do with Canada having an impact on Russia? We'll start with why it matters. Part of the issue comes down to gas and oil ownership. According to Just Energy, the Arctic is believed to be home to at least 90 billion barrels of oil, along with 1,669 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. Add 44 billion barrels of natural gas liquid into the mix, and you have extremely rich territory. The oil alone offers billions of dollars in potential revenue. At the time of creating this video, a barrel of crude oil sold for $82.71, meaning 90 billion barrels would equate to revenue of more than $7.4 trillion. Even more importantly, these oil and gas deposits are only what's been discovered thus far. As Just Energy notes, much of the Arctic region remains unexplored, both due to territorial disputes and the many challenges that come with exploring such an inhospitable region, meaning there may be more oil and gas available. Oil and gas are important for Russia. Its energy sector accounts for 20% of its gross domestic product, or GDP, on average per year, with that number fluctuating based on prices. If Russia can control more oil and gas, it can also control supply and thus strengthen its geopolitical and economic influence. Russia's claims over the Arctic are intended to create that influence, with Canada being one of the key countries standing in its way. It also shouldn't escape mention that Canada is making its own claims over the Arctic seabed. The oil and gas Russia seeks could end up in Canadian hands if Canada is successful, representing a threat to Russia's slice of the energy markets. So Russia has a twofold goal: to get more oil and gas while keeping those resources out of the hands of other countries that have stakes in the Arctic, such as Canada and the United States, in the process. There are other economic factors at play for Russia. According to the Carnegie Endowment, about a third of all the fish harvested in Russia comes from the Arctic, turning the waters into one of the country's key food sources. Russia will naturally benefit from the warming of the Arctic waters, more on that later, by 2030, which it believes will push fish stocks northward and into its existing EEZs. Still, having control over more of the Arctic would mean more freedom for its fishing industry. The Arctic could transform into Russia's primary source of food, with the fish it catches also being exportable to offer a boost to its economy. It's also worth noting that Russia already has extensive control over Arctic waters. The Arctic Council is an intergovernmental forum that promotes cooperation between the 8 nations that have coastlines letting out into the Arctic Ocean. Both Russia and Canada are key members of that council. According to the Arctic Council, Russia accounts for 53% of the Arctic's ocean coastline, with the country having 2.5 million people living in what it considers Arctic territory. Russia also believes that its history in the Arctic should entitle it to a great share of the ocean's waters. As the Carnegie Endowment points out, Russia has maintained a presence in the ocean for several centuries. In fact, it was the discovery of oil and gas in Siberia, which sits both below and above the Arctic Circle, that played a huge role in Russia's economic expansion in the post-Soviet era. Those discoveries underwrote the country's domestic economic stability. Therefore, gaining access to the billions of barrels of oil and trillions of cubic feet of gas confirmed to be on the Arctic Ocean's shelf would ensure greater economic stability for Russia, which it believes is backed by historical claims. What does all of this mean so far? Russia and Canada find themselves in a battle for supremacy over the Arctic waters that lie outside of their EEZs. Both have submitted claims to the UN for sovereignty over waters outside of these, though Russia's 2021 claim is the most egregious, given that it would essentially give Moscow control over the entire Arctic beyond other countries' EEZs. Russia's actions in Ukraine have also stalled negotiations related to these territorial disputes. Control over these waters would be invaluable to both Russia and Canada economically because of the oil and gas deposits in the Arctic, both discovered and undiscovered. Plus, that control would strengthen both countries' fishing industries, with Russia in particular having the potential to turn the Arctic Ocean into its primary food source. Each of these issues highlights why Canada could become such a threat to Russia. If it's able to expand its territorial claims over the Arctic at the expense of Moscow, it gets access to oil and fishing that Russia desires. This wouldn't be enough to collapse Russia's economy. It would still be an oil and gas-rich nation, with much of these resources coming from EEZs it already has in place in the Arctic. But Russia would lose a chance at improving both its economic and food stability, the latter being an important issue given that 400,000 Russians were identified as severely food insecure on average between 2019 and 21. However, these issues, though important, don't represent the largest threat that Canada poses to Russia in the Arctic. That can be summed up in 3 words: the Northwest Passage. To the world's early explorers, the Northwest Passage was more of a myth than a realistic possibility. However, that didn't stop centuries of expeditions designed to find a safe route through the Arctic waters, due in large part to the trading benefits such a route would provide. Discovering the Arctic, a UK-based research group, offers a general timeline of the search for a true Northwest Passage. It says that the Inuit are largely considered to be the first group of people that explored the Arctic, with those explorations leading them to discovering a Northwest Passage they could use for trading. However, the passage was constricted during this period, with the Inuit unable to see beyond local trading routes because they had yet to discover the wider world outside of their territory. The real search began in the 16th century. By this point, European and Asian countries were trading regularly and had well-established seaborne routes to one another. The problem was that these routes required crews to spend months at sea, with a ship sailing from Europe to Asia having to navigate around southern Africa to reach its destination. A shorter route was required, which led to explorers turning their attention to the northern waterways. Martin Frobisher was one of the first to attempt to establish a Northwest Passage. In 1576, he took a small fleet into the northern waters, intent on finding a safe route through them. He failed. 2 years at sea led him to an inlet that now bears his name, but he could go no further. Others followed in his wake, though all similar attempts failed. That is until 1845, when Queen Victoria of England gave the order for Sir John Franklin to finally establish a safe Northwest Passage. Franklin was well equipped. He had a crew of 134 sailors and 3 years of supplies to supplement the voyage. The family members of the sailors were so confident in his upcoming success, they even sent letters to China. Those letters would never reach the sailors. By 1848, it was clear that Franklin's men hadn't made it through the Northwest Passage. Rescue ships were sent out multiple times over the decade that followed, with more than 2,000 men and 40 ships searching for Franklin's ships. Finally, 1859 brought with it the discovery of corpses on King William Island, as well as documentation that indicated that Franklin's ships had become frozen in the ice, his men dying as they desperately searched for land on which to alight. Still, Franklin had discovered several links in the Northwest Passage, with the later rescue attempts discovering even more. Mapping of the region was within the world's grasp, though it would be almost 50 years until another explorer finally succeeded. That man was Roald Amundsen, a Norwegian who sailed the entire Northwest Passage in a simple 21-foot fishing boat named the Gajoa. On the way, he encountered several Inuit tribes, whose knowledge of the Arctic waters proved invaluable in helping him to map out the various links through the passage. He also encountered ice, being forced to wait for months on end at various points before his ship could pass through on its voyage to the South Pole. Amundsen had essentially created a proof of concept. Sailing through the Northwest Passage was possible, though it came at great cost. Having to wait for the ice to melt meant that the route still wasn't usable for trade, as the months wasted on waiting made the more traditional routes more viable. The Northwest Passage remained a legend, but that's looking as if it might change. As discovering the Arctic notes, finding a secure route through the Northwest Passage today would make maritime voyages almost 4,350 miles shorter than they currently are. Right now, ships sailing from the Americas or Europe into Asia typically pass through the Panama Canal, with the establishment of a reliable route saving around 2 weeks on a typical voyage. The organization uses a voyage between London and Tokyo as an example. Today, completing that voyage using the Panama Canal requires a ship to sail almost 14,300 miles. Even using the Suez Canal only slashes around 1,250 miles from the journey. If a Northwest Passage existed, shipping companies could save time and money, with the passage likely transforming into one of the most important in global maritime trade. However, the same problem that stopped so many early explorers in their tracks still exists: ice. Only the most heavily reinforced icebreakers are currently able to make their way reliably through the Northwest Passage due to it being frozen over for most of the year. So we come back to a question: what does any of this have to do with Russia and Canada? Earth.org provides the answer. In a September 2021 article, created around the same time that Russia made its submission to the UN, it revealed that the frozen waters of the Northwest Passage aren't likely to stay frozen for much longer. It says that global warming has caused the Arctic to warm at a rate that's twice that of any other region in the world, with that warming leading to extensive ice loss. The volume of ice in the Arctic has already fallen by 75% since the 1980s, the resource claims, with 2050 potentially bringing with it the first ice-free summers the Northwest Passage has ever experienced if the current rate of global warming goes on unabated. Those transformations in the Arctic are huge for Russia, Canada, and any other nation that lays claims to the Arctic waters. With the disappearance of ice comes the possibility of establishing a Northwest Passage that can be navigated without ice-breaking vessels. The melting also promises greater access to the natural resources buried within the Arctic's continental shelf, including oil, gas, and metals that could include iron, copper, nickel, zinc, and phosphates. New shipping routes could be created, and with them, greater control over maritime trade for any nation that owns these routes. There will also be military possibilities. A country that controls the Northwest Passage could not only fill the waters with its own ships, but bar those ships from traveling from conflicting countries. Russia has already shown a defined interest in establishing northern maritime trade routes. In September 2023, Reuters reported on Russia's work with India and China in its efforts to create more ice-breaking vessels that would allow it to boost trade via the Northern Sea Route. Though not the same and not as expansive, the North Sea Route runs into many of the same problems in terms of ice blocking the shipping route. The route, which runs from the Russian port of Murmansk eastward toward the Bering Strait in Alaska, has long been seen as an alternative to using the Suez Canal by Russia. It's also seeing an increasing amount of trade pass-through. Russia used this North Sea route to transport 34 million tons of cargo in 2022. It hopes to more than double that to 80 million by the end of 2024, with the projected number rising again to 200 million tons by 2031. Russia believes it needs 50 more icebreaker vessels to hit the 200 million ton target. The melting of the Arctic ice may make that moot. The point here is that Russia views the northern Arctic waters as a vital trading route of which it wants to take advantage. The same applies to Canada, and it's recognized the potential these waters hold for over a decade. In October 2013, Gerard Kenny published an article in the Canadian Encyclopedia in which he noted that ice is the only thing that prevents reliable east-west shipping through the Northwest Passage, and that this ice will become less of a problem as Arctic glaciers and snowfields disappear. It's for these reasons that the Arctic, and the Northwest Passage in particular, has the potential to become a geopolitical flashpoint in the coming years, especially once the Arctic ice melts. But what do you think? What role will Canada play in the future of northern trade routes, and does it really have enough power to threaten Russia? How far do you think Russia will go in its efforts to exert its influence over the Arctic over the next few decades? Share your thoughts in the comments, and thank you for watching the video.